As the 20th mainline installment in the Call of Duty series, Modern Warfare 3 defies the odds this year, despite reports suggesting Modern Warfare 3 was originally meant as an expansion to 2022's Modern Warfare 2, and despite reports that the game's been in development for a mere 18 months, it has in fact materialized as a fully fledged release. And so here we are. It doesn't skimp on the options, though it does use the same front-end menu as last year's game, now called COD HQ. Here, everything Modern Warfare 3 is laid out on its own row: multiplayer, ground war, and the zombies mode. We get a new campaign mode too, of course, 14 story missions, many of which boast the linear, often bombastic, set-piece heavy design we expect of the series, except these are now mixed in with new open-world style missions, letting us loose on large sandbox areas, letting us tackle objectives in any way we choose. Between planting GPS trackers across a fortified dock and blowing up helicopters around a military compound, these sandbox levels are the biggest departure from the Call of Duty formula. Even on first glance, Modern Warfare 3 is clearly more of an iterative release. It's hard to ignore that shortcuts, at times smart shortcuts, are taken to hit its November release. Firstly, the campaign is short. Also, too many levels use this open world mission type to pad out the adventure. Often in these, you'll spend the time navigating the map, ticking checkboxes essentially, before going to a final marker. There's potential in the idea of more open-ended Call of Duty missions, but the goals here often feel detached from the main, often well-choreographed missions. And then there's the online multiplayer. We get 16 team deathmatch maps at launch. Not a bad number per se, except all of them are remakes from the 2009 Modern Warfare 2. There are no original maps for 6v6 games, in other words, though new maps are reportedly due post-launch. In fairness, tapping into the nostalgia for a 14-year-old game pays off well at first. It's a crowd-pleasing move for long-term fans of the series, and each map presents as a 1-to-1 scale for the originals. Terminal, high-rise, all the classics are here, with visuals updated on the latest IW engine. But again, the impression is there wasn't enough time to make new 6v6 maps at launch. To give Modern Warfare 3 its dues, the big ground war games do at least take place on 3 new battlefields. Plus, the zombies mode is set across a giant new map called Urzikstan. In fact, this Urzikstan map gives us an early look at the setting for Warzone's big refresh in December. Also, many of the high points of the IW engine tech return, so character model and motion capture quality are exceptional, even during in-engine rendered cutscenes. There's a near photorealistic look to the way characters' eyes move, to material lighting, to the way cloth physics, even beard physics on our man Captain Price during this airdrop. Lighting and volumetric effects are standout across the opening prison break sequence. The rising dust, the smoke inside each warehouse adds an extra sense of depth across the scene. And again, for PS5 and Series X at least, it all runs at 60 frames per second, and even up to 120 FPS at points if your display supports the 120Hz option. The game's bigger issues perhaps show up on the Xbox Series S release. As we'll get to, it has feature parity with PS5 and Series X, broadly speaking, but the frame rate, notably in the campaign mode, shows signs Series S is now struggling to keep 60 FPS locked down. To the comparisons first, and as ever with Call of Duty, the IW engine scales its visuals impeccably to all systems. For competitive fairness online, it's essential that scene detail, even to the very far horizon, remains exactly in place, at least for the most part. And so it goes for PS5, Series X and S, where the technical makeup is much the same as last year's Modern Warfare 2. Pitting PS5 against Series X, each pushes an identical 4K image. Temporal anti-aliasing is in effect, alongside a form of reconstruction to create a final 3840 by 2160 result. That is, even if the true pixel counts behind the scenes adjust dynamically based on GPU load. Oddly enough, the illusion of a 4K image does break quite often. For example, taking the very first frame of a camera cut during this airdrop sequence, certain edges appear to resolve at just 1920 by 1080. Potentially, this 1080p image is the lower bounds for PS5 and Series X, and it does rise after that point, but it's something to bear in mind. It's a quirk shared on both premium machines. Other than that, it's much the same deal. Besides a slight difference in colour grading on the opening prison level, and occasional texture issues due to asset streaming within the first moments of a level, neither console misses out. Now for Xbox Series S. Visually speaking, the turnout is excellent for a 4 teraflop machine, and it sticks to 1440p as its target resolution, though much like PS5 and Series X, certain frames appear to scale down to 50% per axis of that target, which in Series S's case means that parts of the image render at 1280 by 720. All this again is reconstructed to 1440p, and again there are numbers in between. Compared to Series X directly, there's no question. Image quality suffers as a result. On fine grass detail or meshwork on fences, visibility is a competitive advantage on PS5 and Series X, and especially so when it comes to bigger ground war games with as much more detail in the horizon. But for team deathmatch games on smaller maps, I've got to say it's really less of an issue. The only other big downgrade to Series S is in screen space reflection quality, SSR. Notably on water select roads, the coverage is less exact on Series S by comparison, which drops to a lower preset. The settings in every other regard though are the same. Textures, shadows, and even draw distances are a match to maintain parity online. That being said, geometry quality is slightly improved on Series X and PS5. It's a nitpick, but in Mission 5, Series X uses higher LOD settings for geometry across the hill ahead. And so on Series S, it just takes a little bit more of a walk forward for these details to materialize. So that's the setup, but before we get to performance testing, let's take a quick detour. I've focused so far on the campaign side, but really it's the multiplayer mode where most COD players truly spend their time. And for team deathmatch players this year, it's a real nostalgia trip seeing so many classic maps return. There's a 14-year gap, if you can believe it, between the original 2009 Modern Warfare 2 and this year's rebooted MW3. And so here's a comparison with the originals as played on a PS3. They are remixed, revamped, remade, whichever word you'd like to use, with much improved materials, plus they make extensive use of the lighting and volumetric systems native to the IW9 engine. And while the remade levels today are heavily colour saturated, let's say, moving away from the monochrome greys, browns and greens of the originals, each is still remade with a lot of care. All the geometry is replaced, built from the ground up, with dimensions kept one-to-one to the originals. Maps like Terminal, Estate, Favelas each adhere to the 2009 version template. But then we get clear embellishments over the top. Looking at the Favelas area, rubble and decorative detail are either added or removed on the road, while building sides are now adorned with aircon units, flags and actual windows. Alongside the texture changes, it's a huge but often surface level change. And then, as we turn the corner, background detail is also much better fleshed out now, with houses lining up the hill. There's clearly no end to the number of changes you can point out here. The terminal map, for example, gets a very glossy makeover, with its lobby floors varnished to make way for reflections, while volumetric light streaks through the space. Even the lamp lights at the reception desk spread light across nearby geometry now. And likewise, on the scrapyard map, the metals of the plane on the right side of this comparison now feature a high-quality metallic shader, while screen space reflections are deployed across newly added puddles. Add in the enhanced shading between objects, ambient occlusion, and the scene is much more naturally bedded in. There are also obvious creative liberties taken on certain maps, not just limited to new materials. The estate map, for example, has a few extra areas around the perimeter. The trees in the original map are cut down to improve visibility on this strait, and then on the other side of the lodge, the area is expanded outwards, removing this white picket fence to let players get closer to the lake. But the key thing is, it doesn't affect the core map design. For the most part, and having played the original Modern Warfare 2 back in the day, I just found my map knowledge of the originals translated right across. The only real issue I have is the colour grading of these new levels, which have an almost cartoon-like saturation to them. But that aside, it's fun to see these maps through the lens of the latest IW technology. Next up, let's jump to performance testing, and this is where we see the benefits of playing on PS5 and Series X, especially so if you want to play at 120fps online. But first, the basics, starting with the default 60fps mode in campaign. The good news is PS5 and Series X are typically rock solid in their delivery of each mission. There are a few exceptions, as always. Certain points in the level do drop into the high 50s, if briefly, like this walk past the prison cells in Mission 1. Both PS5 and Series X lurch with this odd, repeated pattern between 50 and 60, almost like it's switching between resolution targets. It's equally bizarre because it affects both machines to just the same extent. And then, sticking to this level, we see drops in a later shootout across this courtyard, only on Series X. It's here that PS5 tends to get a cleaner 60fps lock overall, but neither machine gets away 100% unscathed. Each typically gives a good showing at 60fps for the rest of it. It's just there is a trend for PS5 to avoid these minor drops in battle that we do get on Series X. And then there's another catch on Xbox consoles, in that we have a hitching issue on Series X at consistent points. So in the fourth mission, for example, every time I approach this door, we get a cluster of dropped frames. But if we switch to PS5 in the same test, this area flows into the next without any hitching at all. As far as the general GPU side stress points go at 60fps, PS5 has this minor advantage then, but the fact is most of actual gameplay is otherwise flawless on both machines at 60, and that carries right through to any form of multiplayer. Team deathmatch games show the very occasional, odd single frame drop from time to time, but these small maps are generally more dependable than the campaign. And then there's the likes of Ground War, using grander maps, pushing for vehicles and multiple enemies on screen. Or even the likes of the zombie mode, which tests the IW engine tech with extreme terrain scaling. In both tests, PS5 and Series X just fly through. It speaks to the scalability of the engine that it's not stressing either past their limits. At worst, we lose a couple of frames every now and then, and based on these results, to truly see the limits of PS5 and Series X, capping at 60fps just isn't terribly revealing. Rather, we have to switch to the 120Hz mode to see the full range of performance. And it must be said, even with variable results on each console at 120fps, Call of Duty as a series generally still benefits from a doubling in refresh. Is 120fps viable then in Modern Warfare 3? Well, looking at the campaign mode, all the stress points are essentially laid bare within a 120Hz container. It's worth saying the resolution bounds stay in place from the default 60Hz mode here, so we get 1080p to 4K. And in truth, the range of performance is between 60 to 120fps during the most taxing missions. So the first mission climax has a huge drop to near 60fps on both machines just as we run through this arch. Each also deploys adaptive VSync, with tearing kicking in right at the top third of the display. Still, this is the lowest point on record, and generally speaking, missions unfold at between 80 and 100fps, sometimes even higher for interior areas, which is absolutely fine. I say that because even with these drops, if you happen to be armed with a VRR supporting display, you'll get an overall benefit in controller response, plus smoother on-screen motion. A particular highlight is the payload level, which is Mission 4, which gives us a grassy expanse that runs at between 90 to 120fps as you pick off enemies from range. It genuinely works well, and while not perfectly smooth, the variance in frame times isn't as noticeable as, say, a sub 60fps drop might be. So again, on balance, if you're able to run at 120Hz, it's worth using the option on PS5 and Series X. All round, it's more illuminating to have PS5 and Series X run at 120Hz. The campaign is a good repeatable test, but really multiplayer is where the competitive advantage shows. Now, in using the remade 2009 Modern Warfare 2 maps, the scale of each area is somewhat contained. The net positive is both Series X and PS5 get to 120fps more consistently in this mode. Entire stretches unfold at that top line impressively, with occasional drops plus tearing in concert. There's nothing to really test either machine here. Between maps like Terminal, Wasteland, Underpass, Afghan, it all flows pretty smoothly. The bigger maps in the ground war mode though tend to be more taxing, inevitably, but still for the most part it's a convincing 120fps experience. The worst drops in fact tend to be in these big overviews of the map from inside the chopper, though on the ground level it sticks much closer to the mark. As for the zombies mode, on the full-scale Urzikstan map, we're off to a great start again, but it does start dipping below once you get too many enemies congested in one spot. One to watch out for, especially if you manage to get further into the centre of the map. The turnout for PS5 and Series X is respectable then, but let's turn the spotlight to Series S next. Sadly, even play at the regular 60fps is troubled here, the campaign itself often running between 40 and 60fps. Set piece after set piece, the opening mission puts the machine through its paces. The prison yard battles, the escape route, it's the least stable 60fps experience I've seen from a Call of Duty on Series S to date. Even the open sandbox missions later on are struggling. You get constant tearing at the top of the display and drops well into the 40s during any battle around helicopters. And the climax here at a reactor core is a particular low point. The volumetric effects, the enemies all contained in this small area, drag Series S to visible dips into the 30s. In fairness, later missions like Payload, with its broad open areas, do stick closer to 60fps on Series S, especially once we get into the interior part of the level. But on the whole, it's clear that Series S is not the priority for optimization for Modern Warfare 3. The focus from developer Sledgehammer, it seems this time, is clearly to get PS5 and Series X running well above all else. If there is an upside to Series S, it's that the team deathmatch games run mostly fine. It's certainly palatable if all you want is 6v6 matchups at 60fps, where most maps only suffer from drops to 50fps with tearing. The real stress point, surprisingly, is this estate level. Combine this overview from the Lodge with an explosive kill streak and you have all the ingredients you need for some sizable, sustained drops to the 40s. This isn't an outlier either. The estate level tends to have regular problems on Series S, but even the sub-base map has passages of play right at the 50fps line. It's really, again, well below where Call of Duty needs to be as an experience, though at least a majority of the 16 maps do tend to hold closer to 60fps as an average. Also, surprisingly, Ground War and even the Zombies mode hold up reasonably well on Series S. Perhaps it's the sparseness of the level design, but it seems we get fewer drops than you might expect. Still, all of this underlines the fact that Series S is challenged in locking at 60fps as a target, let alone 120, which is an option, to be clear, just like the other current-gen consoles. Okay, for the sake of thoroughness, let's check out that 120Hz mode on Series S, which is a curious extra all things considered. In the campaign mode, running through all the paces of the first mission, it's barely able to stretch up past 80fps and typically nestles at that 60fps line. And none of the later sandbox style missions fare much better, honestly. It's often hovering at just above 60fps with some brief flashes upwards. Say if you look at the sky or something like that. Now here's a quick three-way comparison with PS5 and Series X for context. We've got matching scenes here and, to be blunt, it's just not hitting the same standard. Possibly with a few cutbacks in visual settings it might draw closer, but then we lose parity with the other consoles in multiplayer. I will say I've removed the tailline indicators here just for legibility in this three-way split, but all three are clearly tearing as they go through. In short, Series S falls very short at 120Hz, and that extends to the multiplayer of course. Team deathmatch games, the ground war games, the zombies mode, all struggle, though simpler maps like Terminal do at least run between 80 to 100fps. And likewise, less grueling, less player congested parts of the ground war maps also get close to 100fps for a spell. So this mode does have some use. Better that we have the option at least on Series S, and there's no question that uncapping it to 120fps on a VRR supporting display will reap some benefits at least in input response. It's just that the reality is PS5 and Series X and PC of course enjoy a big advantage potentially, not just in visibility but also in the smoothness of motion with 120fps enabled. In many ways, Modern Warfare 3 still ends up feeling like an expansion to last year's game, more so than any Call of Duty release in a long time. Now, I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a good time with it. The IW rendering tech, the online infrastructure, the gameplay loop of team deathmatch games are all in place. In terms of the content added to the COD HQ front end, what we have is enjoyable. It's just whether this is all enough to justify the full price tag of the game. Now, technically speaking, PS5 and Series X run the campaign well, with a slight advantage to PS5 for avoiding the hitching. Series S, on the other hand, is really meant as a 60 FPS experience at best, and it's there that standards appear to be slipping in locking to a frame rate. It's a bit of a concern for future games in the series potentially, in terms of how optimization is being handled on current gen. In general though, the game's most obvious fault falls on the point of longevity of appeal. The campaign length is short and padded with these open-ended levels, plus we need some actual new team deathmatch maps. The 16 remade MW2 maps are fun for a while, but many of us will have had our fill of these 14 years ago. And it's fair to say we need more new maps mixed in to make the package worthwhile. But for the main Modern Warfare 3 game, that's all for today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But for now, thanks for watching.